This week on RSBANDB Update, Mod Pebble joins us to discuss Purple Tuesday and a drive for accessibility within RuneScape. We then learn about Carid's Garden arriving Monday, and we recap Jagex's 2021 financials and look at RuneScape going to print with Titan Publishing. This is RSBANDB Update, episode 907, recorded Thursday, November 3rd, 2022. Purple accessibility. Hello everybody, and thank you for joining us for another episode of RSBANDB Update. This week is a busy week here at the podcast. We got a lot to talk about, a lot of news relating to the updates, but we're going to actually dive straight in this week because we do have a very special guest on the podcast this week, joining Tanis and myself to talk about accessibility. And I know, Tanis, this is something you and I talk about for every update that comes out, and it's just such a privilege to be able to have this discussion today, given what this week is.
Yeah, this is very near and dear to my heart, as all of you know, and I couldn't be more excited to have who we have today.
That's right. And joining us on the podcast this week is Mod Pebble, a QA analyst on the RuneScape team, and she's here to talk about accessibility. Welcome aboard.
Yeah. Nice to be on here.
This week was Purple Tuesday, which is a global social movement for improving the experience for disabled people and their families. And as such, the RuneScape team has put out a survey asking about accessibility in RuneScape. And we're going to talk with you, Mod Pebble, just about that. But before we begin, I'll just remind our listeners that we have full show notes available at update.show. If you want to follow along with us, you can find me in game at Shane12088. Tanis can be found at Tanis79. And Mod Pebble, is there anything you'd like to say to introduce yourself before we jump straight in?
Oh, I guess I can say I'm Mod Pebble. I'm a QA analyst on RuneScape. I've been on the team for 5 years almost, so quite a while now. And I've been focusing on accessibility for the past 2 years now or so. And when the opportunity for Purple Tuesday came up, it was sort of fell naturally to me. So, yeah. That's
really great to hear. And everybody, when we look at accessibility, probably thinks that's something that people who might just have a hearing impairment or a visual impairment might use. But if we look at this broadly, what is accessibility in your perspective?
Accessibility, it's such a large topic. There are so many areas of what accessibility is, and it's a tough one to sort of narrow down to any one thing. But I guess accessibility to me, it's about removing the barriers for people to be able to play the game as we would want them to play the game. So if we talk about visual accessibility, for example, being able to see the boss or being able to see an NPC isn't a part of the challenge of the game.
Right.
So removing those barriers to allow those players to play the game is what accessibility is about, I guess.
All right, and I think that kind of answers the next one about why it's so important for RuneScape, because to use the analogy you just said, for somebody who doesn't have any accessibility needs, we take it for granted that we can see the boss or hear whatever sound cue is happening that's telling us what's going to happen next. But I guess in that case, if accessibility isn't taken to heart on that, that just makes the game so much more difficult for that segment of the player base.
Absolutely, yeah. And it can cover such a wide variety of things. Like if you're looking at sort of environment, and if there's lots of visual clutter on there, for someone with ADHD or anything like that, your mind might be jumping to everywhere in the map rather than to the NPC that's hidden away at the corner, for example. And stuff like that is sort of how wide-reaching it can be, especially for how much of our player base or how more common something like ADHD or neurodivergence is.
That's interesting you mentioned that, because when it comes to accessibility in games, most of us are just going to think of, the typical accessibility menu that you would see and the impact that has on gameplay or the other tool sets that are involved. And most of the time, if somebody's not visually impaired, hard of hearing, or living with accessibility needs that go beyond those sensory ones that I just mentioned, people don't think about accessibility. And in some cases, I've even heard of cases where non-native English speakers would use subtitles as an accessibility tool just to increase their immersion in the game world. So I guess this just leads to the big question about why. Why should people who don't have a disability care about accessibility in a video game, amongst all things?
This is a very good question, and it's something I've thought a lot about. It's accessible. Something I always go about saying, being front and foremost, is accessibility is for everyone. And accessibility features, like you said, someone who isn't a native English speaker can turn on subtitles. But it can also extend to temporary needs. If you have a baby that's asleep and you want to play a game and listen to the game but cannot have audio on, you can turn on subtitles. Or if you've broken your arm, for example, you can turn on one-handed modes to make the game easier for you to play whilst you're temporarily unable to use that other arm. And there's also, like, if you drop your glasses or you break your glasses, having high contrast modes or being able to increase the UI size and help you around that as well. And we see a lot of this in other games as well, where the best options for being able to play games is delving into the accessibility options, turning down textures or making enemies greater contrast so that you're able to see them against like dark backgrounds and things. And we see a lot of that across the industry and across games in general, of all of these temporary needs. Yeah, I guess that's the best way to put it, just all of these temporary needs.
Yeah, and you mentioned high contrast mode in particular, and I'll just call back to a tweet that you sent out in June from a game jam. You started working on high contrast mode for RuneScape with specific object highlighting and whatnot, and that kind of gives a glimpse of what it could look like. Obviously, at an early state, but folks want to see that, we do have that linked in the show notes. So that was certainly very interesting to see when it came across my radar. And so I guess with all of that and the discussion about why players should care, and that leads us to our next topic about what an individual player can do in relation to improving accessibility, which I'm certain we have an answer to on this. But before we dive too far into that, can you give the listeners a brief overview of what Purple Tuesday is, if they have not heard of it so far?
As we've spoken about before, Purple Tuesday, it's a global social movement designed to improve the customer experience for disabled people and their families. And this covers a wide variety of industries. So the retail industry, eBay are heavily involved in it this year, etc. And it comes to all the little things like, I can't remember what it was called. It was either the daffodil or the sunflower movement, where those with invisible disabilities like autism, etc., would be able to wear like a card that would show that they have a disability and that they need some extra help from those people. And Purple Tuesday is really about bringing that to the forefront and raising awareness around disability as a whole, because it is a very undervalued topic in a lot of places.
All right, fair enough. And with that, I think we head into the survey and initiative you guys are leading for Purple Tuesday on this. And I know Tanis, you wanted to ask a few points on this.
I would just like to start with, so what is the goal of your team with this survey?
Yeah, so when sort of The agreement to get involved into Purple Tuesday sort of fell down to me. It was very difficult. The game is very large as a whole, and there is a lot of areas that we can improve on, and probably a lot of areas where we don't know what we need to improve on. And so realistically, before we can make any fixes or can make any big changes to the game, we needed a way to talk to our player base, particularly our disabled player base, and ask them what impacts them and how can we help make the game better for them. Because without asking our players and without getting that wide variety of experiences, there is no way we would be able to make the changes that we need to be making and targeting the right areas.
And what I can see from that, in terms of just looking at the survey, one thing that was incredibly eye-opening to me is just the breadth of questions that you did ask on this. And as we highlighted in the previous segment, it wasn't just a question of the sensory impairments, visual, auditory, etc. You covered the entire spectrum on that, and that was incredibly eye-opening to me as well on that, just as a player, to learn a little bit more about that. So I think it's a good level of awareness, and bringing this to the player base is hopefully going to be beneficial to you guys.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you look at sort of the disabled community as a whole, 80%, I believe it's 80% if my numbers are correct, are invisible disabilities, which it's so taking into account neurodivergence and stuff, it's something that we really need to be including, because otherwise we are going to be missing the important experiences as well.
Well, I have a question for you, Mod Pebble. When you're looking at the different kinds of disabilities, and you're looking at, things more in the cognitive realm and things like that, what are some of the things that you try to design for, and some of the accessibility measures that you've been exploring when it comes to those particular disabilities?
It's a difficult topic because of how widely neurodivergence affects different people. Everyone is going to sort of have different experiences with it. It's a tough one to design for, and something we sort of generally have to keep in mind, especially, as I've said before, sort of understanding that if there are lots of elements on the screen, it might distract away from what we want the players to be focusing on. Or maybe for someone with ADHD, it might be very difficult for them to concentrate on skilling for long periods of times. Or it might get very overwhelming if they're taking lots of damage from different sources. And it's things like that we need to sort of keep into account. Obviously, there's only so much we can do in that area, but it's something to keep in mind regardless.
Well, very, very much, and that's great, because that is something that, and not only does that cut with those kinds, but it can also affect many different kinds. Like, as a visually impaired person, that visual clutter, it gets me. Something that I tell people too is, with a little bit of extra time, I can do just about anything. But when I'm dealing with timed events and I'm looking at a small piece of a screen because my field of view is restricted, that can be very very difficult. So yeah, there's a lot that you can kind of dig in with that. Now, I have another question about the survey. Now, it specifically asks about what part of the game do your disabilities most affect. So going into this, did you have any preconceptions of what you thought would be the most challenging parts of games for people?
Yeah, there was preconception-wise, there was definitely a few areas that I suspected. I was definitely suspecting color blindness to be an issue, and as well as sort of visual impairments, because parts of the game can be very difficult to read, especially picking up some parts, like dungeoneering, for example. There's a certain puzzle which is very bad for people with color blindness, or just in general, because the light doesn't show up against the background appropriately. And that was definitely one area I suspected would be quite big coming up to this. And then there was also some elements I was expecting where reaction times on bosses and stuff would be particularly difficult for some people. So can you react quick enough to this mechanic and things like that? So I definitely had some preconceptions there, but some are harder to design for than others.
I understand, and I can definitely vouch for what you have already suspected. Those are all things that are challenging, and I can especially remember before. And loot beams have their own special thing, but one thing that comes to mind is when dungeoneering didn't have loot beams for the keys. I don't know how many times I got yelled at for going through a room and seeing a key and just not knowing it was there. So, I feel that one deeply myself.
Yeah.
So now, does this survey represent a renewed push to get accessibility into more game updates?
Absolutely. It's a challenge regardless, and we're always going to make mistakes on this. But there is definitely a renewed push for greater accessibility into our game, and paying more of a focus onto accessibility, as well as going back and fixing anything that might have caused issues in the past. This survey really was to know where we need to prioritize and to raise anything that we might not be aware of as a company.
And one thing I want to highlight now that we're talking about the survey and just how important this is, and what I want everybody to do out there, and we'll have a link in the show notes to the survey at update.show. I want everybody to go fill out this survey, because you do have an option to say, I do suffer from a disability, or I don't. And if you do, you have a field on there where you specifically ask what part of the game could be improved. If there was one update that could be brought to the game to improve accessibility, you ask for that in a very open field. So I want everybody to go and have a look at this survey. It's something that I know, Tanis, you have said time and time again that if I could have one accessibility update, it would be X. And this is the opportunity for everybody in that boat, and even people who don't need accessibility features or don't think they need accessibility features right now. This is your opportunity to fill out this survey. And one thing I appreciated about this is that you didn't just link the survey and allow people who have accessibility needs to fill it out. There's even an option for people who don't have those needs to fill out this survey as well. And that's something that I appreciate, just being able to do that. But I really just want to call home this survey and bring focus to it, because I feel like this is something that the community needs to hear about. And that's primarily why we're having this discussion here this week with you, Mod Pebble. And we're going to talk a bit about the accessibility journey that RuneScape took. But before we move on to that discussion, do you have anything that you would like to say in particular in relation to the survey for people to keep in mind, or just anything about it when people are filling it out?
I guess, yeah, I think especially for if you could make one fix to the game to make it more accessible for you, what would it be? Question. It is very open, and definitely encourage you to sort of think about if you could request any one feature in the game, if you could request one thing that would make your life better, definitely take a little bit to think about that and sort of note down what it is that would make the most impact to you. That way we know how to prioritize what we want to do and when to schedule these things in. Because if it's like a lot of things there, then it can be hard to know how to prioritize it. So breaking it down into what one thing would make your life, or would make the most impact to you, is nice to hear about.
Okay. So with that being said, if you take the survey, if you decide to take the survey, please do fill out the open field near the end. The open fields near the end. That would greatly help out what Mod Pebble is working on.
So I just also want to just reemphasize that even if you aren't someone that needs accessibility in the game, that a lot of accessibility updates actually will make the overall game experience better. And the reason I can say that is we've had updates like Skyboxes, filters, object outlining, the audio cues from the Arc Laker. A lot of things have come into game that were not, billed as accessibility updates. They were for everybody, but they really made a difference for me and for people, that are dealing with different challenges. Interface scaling. I could go on and on.
Absolutely.
So it helps everyone.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's why, we don't want people to see that this is an accessibility survey and, say that, hey, I have close to 20/20 vision, I can hear just fine, I'm going to ignore this. No, if you're listening to this podcast, you should definitely fill this survey out, because it'll help the team and it'll help everybody's experience who plays RuneScape. So,
absolutely.
With that, we're going to, and Tan has mentioned a number of updates, and we're going to talk about the journey of accessibility, because this is something that we've touched on before on the podcast at various points. But Tanis, I don't think we've ever actually collated all this into one segment on this, because when you look at accessibility in RuneScape, it's got an interesting origin, because if you go back to 2001, 2004 for RuneScape 2, it was a game that was played in a web browser, and the game window was fixed. And, of course, now we've got a standalone client, a modifiable UI, text scaling, UI scaling, and whatnot. But there have been times throughout RuneScape's history where it's done things that have been good and bad. And, with that, we start from the fixed small window user interface web browser experience. And back then, if you look at this from an accessibility angle, it might seem bad, but, and I want to get your thoughts on this, Mod Pebble. Tanis, tell everybody why this wasn't necessarily the worst at the time.
No, actually, I was in search of an MMO RPG back in 2008. Now, it might have been 7. Anyway, it was before Windows had a built-in magnifier. So I was still using a third-party software called ZoomText. Now, ZoomText was a wonderful tool that I could magnify everything on my screen. The problem is it did not play well with other programs that would play in their own full screen windows, and a lot of games at that time did not have window mode. So that means that I could not play a World of Warcraft or Guild Wars or anything like that. It wasn't I couldn't do it. So I came to RuneScape because it was in a browser and I could use my ZoomText in the browser. So even though it had the smaller fixed window, this gave me an opportunity to play the kind of game that I wanted to play that I couldn't play anywhere else.
And when you start splitting that apart, that's both a good thing and a bad thing, because, of course, I'm sure you look back at that UI Mod Pebble before 2008 and 2004, and your accessibility mind probably says, "Sheesh, what was going on with that?" But on the other hand, you have Tanis's experience here, so I was just curious if you'd ever run into any kind of perspective like what Tanis has just said on that.
In a weird way, I think I do prefer the older interfaces from an accessibility standpoint. They are a lot smaller. Text isn't great, the size of the models aren't great and stuff, but because there is so much less going on the screen, it's a lot less overwhelming. And
Right.
like I, as a player, play on legacy mode because I find the RuneScape, the modern interface, a lot more overwhelming for me. So in a weird way, I can definitely agree with that. It being so small, however, it does surprise me that you found that to be a benefit for accessibility for you.
Well, and it's because I could use my magnification software,
Absolutely.
and normally I couldn't, right? So there's all kinds of little things that were difficult.
Yeah.
Like with the mouse over text being in the upper left hand corner, right? That was very difficult because if you're
Yeah.
using a magnifier, my field of view is smaller. So I can I couldn't see that mouse over text while doing what I was doing. And over time that has gotten much better with, actual mouse over text and things of that nature. You being able to do keybinds was huge for me.
Yes.
So that kind of stuff. But yeah, I mean, mine, this originally, it came from being able to use the other assistive tech that I had available that I just couldn't use with any other game.
Accidental accessibility.
Yes.
And boy, we're lucky that RuneScape stuck with you. And you mentioned keybinds in particular because that takes us to RuneScape 3 in 2013 with the new interface that came on board. Players can customize their own UI, of course, with this. And I know you have said, Tanis, that it's allowed for better use of screen magnifiers because you could choose where to put things on the screen. But of course, the pitfall of this at the time was that we still didn't have UI or text scaling on this. And I'm going to kind of jump back to what you said, Mod Pebble, about how from a personal perspective you prefer the old UI sometimes because the modern one can be so complicated and busy. And I remember going back when we were first evaluating RuneScape 3 here at the podcast, I said, this UI at some point is going to confuse people just because people are able to lay out so many different panes and whatnot about that. And of course, you look at Twitch streamers, you look at YouTube videos, you see these elaborate, complicated RS UIs, and obviously people have chose to lay that out for their own purposes. But at the same time, I could imagine that having the default, the same defaults that you guys have now is something that's good with that as well on the accessibility side to ensure that just if somebody messes things up too far, we got a sane default that we can all go back to on that. But Tanis, overall, would you say that RuneScape 3 in 2013 was a net positive or not for accessibility from your perspective?
It was a start, but it had a long way to go.
Yeah, and that's why I mentioned the UI and text scaling and whatnot. And maybe we can just go a little bit into your background, Mod Pebble. Do you play RuneScape outside of work? And were you around when RuneScape 3 came out?
Yeah, I've played RuneScape for how long has it been? 2006. So
okay.
16 years?
Okay, so
years?
A long time, just like us.
Yes, yeah, I've played RuneScape for a very long time, so I have a lot of experience all the way from the old version of the game through to RS3 and beyond. It's definitely been an interesting experience. And I think I found that, obviously, since starting work at Jagex, and especially since the move to work from home, I've found less of a want to be playing RuneScape in my own time, simply because working on the game all day and then at the same station playing the game in the evening was getting quite bad for my mental health.
Yeah, fair enough.
I had to take a step back from that.
Yeah.
So I started playing old school now for the most part.
Okay, yeah. And we could have an entire accessibility conversation on old school as well, because if you don't use the third-party clients, you still have that fairly limited UI in that perspective on that. And I know, Janice, that's why you said you were never able to go back and try old school, because you didn't want to give up the creature comforts that you had accessibility wise today.
Yeah, isn't that funny? Like I look back and sometimes I think, how was I able to even do what I did? Because now, maybe I'm a little spoiled with some of the things that I do have. But I couldn't. Yeah, I can't go back, not without the keybinds and some of the very basic things.
Yeah, and
I have.
And, we talked about the launch of RuneScape 3, and obviously with RuneScape 3 came the 6th Age and a whole load of quests, and quests have proven difficult for those with visual impairments, and I'd imagine it factors in with other impairments as well. A few that come to mind are Dishonor Among Thieves, as it requires a wide field on the view for wide field of view on the screen for one of the puzzles. And The Light Within, I heard interesting stories from Tanis's side on the moving objects puzzle on that. So,
and many more. I call these the RuneScape eye test. Yeah,
yeah, and we understand that when these quests are designed, they're designed as puzzles and such. And with this mod Pebble, I guess the question to you is, how much of is there, obviously with our discussion on the survey and Purple Tuesday, is accessibility something that is thought about often in terms of quests and such?
It's definitely considered more and more recently. I think you'll see this in quests that have time limits or require you to click things in certain ways. So I believe Heartstealer Quest, recently came out, and you were given a number of seconds to identify an object that you needed to find, and then click on that object. And there is an accessibility option within that where if you fail, I believe it's either if you fail once or if you fail twice or however many times, you are given the option to slow down how long it takes.
Right.
Yeah, and stuff like that is very much considered, but we still have a way to go, and some things can be forgotten about or not identified. So it's a mixed bag, but it's definitely something we're trying to be better on and trying to improve on.
Yeah,
but it's a journey.
And now that you mentioned puzzles and whatnot, I think the Erebus puzzle in Extinction, I think of the combat encounter in Daughter of Chaos, and when you look at it at the end of the day, sure, that's the case of the puzzle being too difficult for someone, but those are also accessibility modes in the quest as well, in terms of just making it easier and factoring in that, maybe somebody might not be able to navigate through Erebus successfully, or maybe they don't have the field of view to utilize the combat system to its full potential. Yeah,
absolutely.
And these are updates that are brought to the game that people just see as being part of the quest and such. And where I want to go next with this is one of the updates that came with NXT. I think the new game plan in 2016 was the advent of Skyboxes. And I can talk about Skyboxes, but Tanis, you're the one who can really talk about Skyboxes. And there's a question at the end of this for Mod Pebble, so go for it, Tanis.
Cool.
Okay, so for me, Skyboxes were one of the biggest game changers. Now we've had game changers, since then, but this was the first real big one once we got past, keybinds and not having to rely on my mouse for everything. And what they do for me is like I was using the example, I think in pre-show, where I have been, I had to mine Baynite because I'm, just hardcore into this fresh start worlds, and it's all white. It's up there in the Arctic, it's north of Fremennik, and you can't see, or I can't see, the rock opportunities, which when you're in fresh start, you need to be following those rock opportunities, right? We're not playing with perfect potions. We're not playing with stone spirits. You need to follow the rock opportunity. And so it's very difficult to see on that white background. So what I do is I turn the skybox to eclipse, and then I enable a high contrast filter. Basically what that does is it allows me to be able to position the screen in such a way that those rock opportunities are then visible on the black background. And I've used that in many times. I've used another one that used to get me was the ice strike worms. I could never see them on the ground, could never see them moving. So what I would do was I would actually invert colors and use that filter, and that would give me enough contrast where I'd be able to see them move. And so that's just a few examples, but I've used them a lot of times, and they're just always super helpful. And I call it it's definitely a hidden accessibility update. I think it was meant for content creators, but it just opened up a whole new world for me.
And that leads to the question, have things like skyboxes, obviously, like Tana said, initially meant for content creators, have those been thought of more internally through the dev process as something that's a bit of more of an accessibility tool now?
I think, honestly, I've got to say no. I don't think that it's really been considered as anything that is improved people's accessibility. So it's very interesting to hear those stories that they can be used to help see things or to help interact with things. It's very interesting. It's definitely one of those things that is options creating accessibility.
Yeah, exactly.
And you do see that a lot in a lot of places where just the sheer amount of gameplay options available to people does create accessibility.
Yeah, and another one Tana said, I think it was the Christmas loop beam, right? Because it has the sound and the snowfall from it, right?
Yeah, I have been asking for an accessible loop beam forever. Give me an alarm, give me something, because I missed a decayed tooth one time. I've never gotten over it.
God.
Yeah, right. But yeah, the big loop beams that had the big present, that's what I use now, because it's easier to see, it's higher contrast, and there's a little bit of a sound cue. So yeah, and those are things that you just, I don't know if they were ever intended as accessibility updates, but they definitely made a very big difference for me. Along with the changes we saw for mobile with the object outlining, that helped me so much in being able to figure out where those click boxes are.
Yes.
That was very difficult before then. Even updates that you might not even think of, like the graphical updates that we saw with the free-to-play areas, that actually created more contrast where I could tell the foreground from the background a lot easier.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And this is just something that we're highlighting on this accessibility push, and it's obviously a learning experience for us. It's a learning experience for the team at Jagex. It's a learning experience for the player base. It's a learning experience for everybody on this. And what we wanted to highlight with that is that there's just so many little updates that come out that might be geared as tools for everybody else, but in reality, they are accessibility options for somebody else. And then you have, on the flip side, you have skills that were designed to be accessible. And with this, we go to two favorites: the mining and smithing rework with the sound keys for both mining and smithing. It feels like those were, from our perspective, two things that really stood out on that, but specifically the sound cues that worked their way into those updates. And I haven't had a chance to ask Mod Jack on this, if the sound cues for mining and smithing were intended as an accessibility feature, but I'd be curious to hear what your thoughts are on sound cues like that, Mod Pebble.
So I wasn't too directly involved in those projects, so I can only say so much. But at least from my experience with these things is that whilst they are very much accessibility features, they're also part of those things that help the wider player base as well. Because RuneScape is very much a second screen game for most people, right?
Sure.
So if you're looking away from your screen, and you're watching a YouTube video and you hear that sound cue to say that the opportunity has moved or something has changed, that is a prompt for the player. And because of those things, it also becomes an accessibility option and also becomes an accessibility benefit.
All right, that's fair. And, we also had the entire saga of the Elder God Wars, and we had, from our perspective when we were discussing this on the podcast at the time, good and bad experiences. Battle of the Monolith was certainly an interesting time to hear your perspective on that, Tanis. Carapac also posed some interesting challenges from, I think you said, the field of view perspective on that. But like you mentioned, on the other hand, you had Archglacier became an entirely different boss when it added those voice lines, which at the time were seen as adding more immersion for everybody else, but for you, made you actually able to fight the thing, correct?
Correct. Yeah. That was, I still go back to that because it was, I had, up until that point, I wasn't having any luck with the Elder God Wars bosses, right? Like, and I kind of anticipated that. Bossing's always been very difficult, but Carapac was, with the field of view, the problem is I just can never move fast enough, and there's so much going on with that boss that it was, not the best experience for me. But the Art Glacier was, that was incredible once those voice lines came in, and then we went a little bit backwards with Crucis.
but Crosus got better when it got its colorblind mode.
It did. And it's definitely in a better spot than it was. But
at launch,
yeah,
and
for sure.
And this has been the whole story of what we really wanted to highlight in this last segment, is that throughout RuneScape's 20-plus year history, at this point, starting in 2001 from that fixed web browser game to where we are at today, an immersive MMO, it's been a journey for RuneScape accessibility. There have been examples of things that were very good back in the day. There have been examples of things that were very bad back in 2004. But you can say the same thing about 2019 and 2020 as well. Yeah. And I personally, and I don't know if you agree with this, Tanis, because you're on the front lines of this, I feel like things have gotten better over time than they used to be. Is that a fair assessment?
Oh, I think that's a very fair assessment, and that was something that I noticed earlier in the show when Mod Pebble said she's been focusing on this for the last couple of years, and I'm like,
yeah,
last couple of years
it's when really things started really getting better.
Yeah, seriously.
And that brings us to the modernization of RuneScape. Object highlighting, that was very much a mobile thing, but it's available on desktop now if you want it. Dotted paths for tutorials would be great if there was more of those. Interface scaling, huge when you combine that with text scaling and graphical reworks. And like you said at the beginning of the show, Mod Pebble, you look at interface scaling, it might be something that you're playing RuneScape. Today you don't feel like you need, but maybe one day your glasses break and you need to activate that 300% UI scaling mode. And
Absolutely.
There you go. You have that available for you. And as we start to wrap this up here, what is your favorite RuneScape accessibility feature of things we've talked about or things that we might not have talked about here? Because you're obviously immersed in this as part of your job. What do you see as an accessibility hotspot for RS3 right now?
It's a very interesting question. There's a lot going on in RuneScape, so it's very hard to sort of pick any one thing.
Okay.
I think it's definitely the greater understanding of having audio and visual cues in PvM boss fights, or just skilling in general. And I think that is a fundamental in just our boss designs getting a lot better in general, where like a boss will have a audio cue and then a visual cue. there's obviously still work to be done, but it's nice to see that start to get better within our game in general. I think in terms of pure accessibility features, it's got to be UI scaling for me.
All right, fair.
I think it was definitely a feature. It's one of those other examples of this is good for everyone, because UI scaling was terrible for 4K streams, for example, where the UI would be really small and it would be really hard to read. And fixing something like that also is by extension adding accessibility options and making it easier for those who have difficulties with sight to now be able to read the text and stuff on the screen.
All right.
So I think that's that for me.
Yeah, that's fair. And I know I can definitely see that push, because I remember when Zamorak came out this past summer, there were a few of his attacks that were missing the voice cue, and it was patched into the boss within a couple weeks, which, you know, when I learn a new boss, the voice cues are something that I use to help me along because of, as you mentioned, visual clutter. So even as somebody who doesn't use accessibility options most of the time, I greatly appreciated those audio cues, and I think that leans into what you're saying about how it's just become more present over time on that, and that's something that I can appreciate. So I don't think I have anything else for our segment here. Tanis, you have any further questions for Mod Pebble?
No, I just want to say thank you for putting a focus on accessibility and trying to improve the game in this way. It does make a difference, and there are a lot more people out there that face different challenges than I think a lot of us would think, you know, at first glance. So thank you, Mod Pebble.
Thank you. It's definitely nice to have that sort of recognition that it is working in places, and the team as a whole are getting a lot more awareness in this area. So
yeah,
it's coming a lot more naturally.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to speak with us. I know it's late in the evening. This is your personal time, obviously, for this. We greatly appreciate it. And I'll just say, as we wrap this up, just remind everybody to go take the survey. You can find it linked in the show notes at update.show, or you can find it by going to rs.game/accessibility survey. Accessibility, capital A, survey, capital S. rs.game/accessibility survey. Thank you, Mod Pebble.
No problem. Thank you.